In 1348, in one French town, so many people died in a single week that the priest stopped carrying the bodies out. He began burying them directly beneath the church floor and kept holding Mass, praying above bones that were still steaming. What was this? The apocalypse? Divine punishment? Vengeance from the east? No one knew. But everyone, from pope to peasant, was certain the end of the world had arrived, and no one was ready for it. Subscribe to our channel if you enjoy deep, unhurried stories about how everything fell apart long before it became fashionable. And please leave a comment telling us where you're listening from and what time it is there. No joke. We're keeping track of time zones with epidemiological precision. Imagine Europe in the mid-14th century. The world would have seemed slow, but full of life. Cities were growing. Trade was thriving. The church, like Google, Parliament, and TikTok rolled into one, governed belief and behavior. Lords built their castles, peasants tilled their fields, and merchants carried spices from India through Arab cities to Venetian warehouses. And through it all, a firm belief that the order of things was eternal. God watched, the Pope ruled, and power rested on sword and prayer. So it seemed. But far beyond those borders, in Asia, a catastrophe was brewing, one that would sweep away millions of bodies, topple hundreds of thrones, and rewrite the structure of fear itself. No, Europe didn't invent the Black Death. It merely received it. Every catastrophe has its geography. And though the Black Death is often labeled a European tragedy, its origins lie far beyond the borders of Latin, castles, and crucifixes. To understand how one disease in the 14th century could kill a third of the continent, we must go deep into Asia, where Silk roads crossed with roads of war, and the Mongol empires left behind not only destruction, but exchange. And among those exchanges was a bacterium, Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas, living on rats, living among people. The 13th to 14th century was the time of Pax Mongolica, an enormous stretch of land from China to Crimea under Mongol rule. The Mongols destroyed, yes, but they also united. They secured trade routes, connected Asia and Europe like never before, opened the way not just for silk and spices, but for disease. In China, as early as the 1330s, chronicles speak of a strange illness that takes a man in 3 days. Records from Yunnan describe outbreaks where bodies blacken and the tongue dries to blood. Before ships, there were caravans. Merchants moved goods from China through Samarkand, Bukhara, Persia, and on to Crimea, Europe's gateway. Rest stops along the Silk Road, caravanserais, were ideal breeding grounds for disease. Rats traveled in grain sacks, on wagons, in storage buildings. At one rest station near Talas, modern archaeologists have found mass graves from the mid-14th century, with no signs of violence. Likely, plague. One of the most pivotal moments happened during the siege of the city of Kaffa, modern Feodosia, Crimea, in 1346. Kaffa was a Genoese trading post, a key hub between east and west. It came under siege by the Mongol Tatar armies of the Golden Horde. During the siege, an epidemic broke out among the attackers. What did they do? According to Italian chronicler Gabriele de Musi, the besieging forces launched the corpses of their dead into the city using catapults to poison the air. This was not just war. It was 14th century biological warfare. The Genoese survivors boarded ships and fled to Constantinople, Messina, Marseille. With them, rats, fleas, and a perfectly timed incubation period. Death was already en route. The bacterium Yersinia pestis is transmitted via flea bites or airborne droplets once lungs are infected. Key conditions: crowding, poor sanitation, human movement. But 14th century people didn't know bacteria. They saw stars behaving strangely, air that smelled wrong, heretics, strangers, women with herbs. In many towns, Jewish quarters were attacked even before the first symptoms appeared, just in case. The disease hadn't arrived, but the panic had. The timeline: 1346, Kaffa; 1347, Constantinople; 1347, Sicily, Genoa, Marseille; 1348, northern Italy, France, Spain; 1349, England, Scotland, Germany; 1350, Scandinavia. Each ship was like a dark letter. It delivered not goods, but silence, which in 2 weeks would become moaning and the stench of corpses. The Black Death was not a punishment from heaven. It was the consequence of trade, war, and a tightly connected world. Globalization without medicine, mobility without vaccines, a map with no concept of bacteria. Death arrived by sea. Under sails no one inspected. Medieval Europe had no health inspections. No customs official checked for illness. No port asked for a crew wellness certificate. So when Genoese ships arrived in Sicily in October 1347, carrying fabric, grain, and wine, they brought something else. Something that had no smell, no passport, and killed within days. Italian chronicler Michel da Piazza wrote, "A terrible disease began in the city. People died so quickly they had no time to confess. Blood came from their mouths and noses, and their bodies blackened within hours." The ships from Kaffa docked in Messina. Some crew were already dead. Others died the next day. Local authorities had no idea what to do. They unloaded the cargo, expelled the crew. But the rats and fleas had already disembarked. Within 4 weeks, the plague reached Catania, Palermo, and crept along the coastline. November 1347, the plague hit Genoa. The very city that had once sent traders to Kaffa was now a new epicenter. In Marseille, it arrived in December. Chroniclers said, "Not even the sea could cleanse the air." By spring 1348, the disease had reached the Iberian Peninsula. Valencia, Barcelona. Maritime trade became a death channel. No city wanted to halt commerce. Trade mattered more than rumors. Cities began closing their gates. Too late. People fled from cities to villages, unintentionally spreading the disease farther. The church organized penitential processions, begging God to stop the plague. In Florence, authorities ordered daily prayers and harsh punishment for those living in sin, assuming the plague had moral vision. The disease began with fever and weakness. Then came the buboes, painful swellings in the groin, neck, behind the ears, then fever, hallucinations, vomiting, gangrene. In its pneumonic form, coughing blood, death within 24-48 hours. Chronicles say some walked down the street and collapsed dead at the church door. Not just Europe. Constantinople was already infected in 1347. Byzantine chronicler Nikephoros Gregoras wrote that candles burned constantly in churches, for the dead arrived without pause. The city became a major node for spreading the plague into the Balkans, Asia Minor, and Slavic lands. People buried their families without rites. Graves were dug in haste, often mass pits for dozens of bodies. Despair turned into epidemic nihilism. Some ran to monasteries. Others lived like it was their last day. In Avignon, then the seat of the Pope, Records describe Pope Clement VI sitting between two large fires, hoping the smoke would protect him from infection. Europe's first contact with the plague was sudden and explosive. It still didn't fully realize the storm that had begun, but already black ships moved from port to port, leaving behind emptiness. The plague was not quiet. It whispered in lungs, bubbled in blood, groaned through the body, and it left visible traces that required no medical training. Black swellings, glassy eyes, a smell so strong the blind could sense it. This chapter is not about statistics. It's about what death looked like. Imagine a city, let's say Florence, or Lyon, or London. Doesn't matter. The streets stink. Corpses have been lying out for 2 days and no one's collecting them. Churches are full, not with people, but with whispered prayers stripped of belief. Markets are empty. Sellers have died. Buyers are afraid. Houses are locked from the inside, sometimes with the dead still inside. One witness wrote, "Sometimes the yard would only be opened when the smell became unbearable, and they'd carry out everyone at once, the living and the dead." The first day, headache, weakness, fever. Then buboes, large swollen lumps in the groin, neck, under the arms. They turned black, painful, and ruptured. Inside, pus and blood. In the pneumonic form, coughing blood, chest pain, suffocation. In septicemic form, skin turned blue, consciousness faded, death in a day. The sick screamed from pain, bit themselves, lost their minds. One monk wrote how his brother began singing psalms and ended sobbing on the floor, foam on his lips. A typical plague doctor wore a beaked mask, filled with scented herbs like lavender, mint, rosemary, a waxed cloak, gloves, a cane to avoid touching patients. They could do nothing. Prescribe herbal infusions, bloodletting, prayer. In Paris, doctors advised not to breathe too deeply and to avoid moist places. In Avignon, doctors took payment in advance. They often didn't survive to finish treatment. Funeral crews became delivery services. Show up, collect, dump in a pit. In big cities, mass graves were dug, bodies buried in layers. Priests stopped reading rites for each individual. There wasn't time. A Venetian chronicler wrote, "We became a people that no longer buries, we throw." Mothers abandoned children, children abandoned parents. Servants fled if the master fell ill. Husbands and wives stopped touching. One letter from Florence read, "I lie alone. Who will bring me water, if not myself?" In another town, women started wearing iron crosses as earrings. So death remembers I belong to someone. Priests died first. They were there at people's final moments. Often they couldn't bless graves, just scattered a handful of earth. Some monasteries lost all but a few brothers within a month. Pope Clement VI granted general absolution to all who died of plague. No one had time for last rites. The plague was not a number. It was a scream, a smell, an empty bed, a house where the water still boils. But the woman who lit the fire has been buried for a week. Medieval Europe wasn't prepared, and instead of an army, it faced something worse, a fear that didn't need weapons. When everything collapses and no cause is visible, the mind demands order. The medieval person looked for it. Divine punishment, a cursed alignment of stars, poisoned wells, a stranger with an evil eye. There were no answers. So came the defense mechanisms, moral, political, aggressive. In 1348, Venice became the first city to introduce a 30-day waiting period for ships arriving from suspicious regions. Soon, the rule expanded to 40 days, 40 giorni, from which the word quarantine is derived. On the islands of Lazaretto and Santa Maria, they created the first quarantine stations, where sick and suspect individuals were isolated. People were forced to live in wooden shacks on water, cut off from families. For a medieval person, isolation was worse than death. Across Europe, religious processions began. People walked barefoot through cities with candles, chanting prayers. Then came the rise of flagellants, fanatics who whipped themselves, believing they could cleanse humanity's sin through pain. In Germany, France, Poland, the flagellants attracted thousands. They sang psalms, then merged back into the crowds, spreading the plague as they went. In many cities, Jewish communities became the target. Accused of poisoning wells or summoning the miasma through witchcraft, confessions were tortured out, followed by executions and mass burnings. In Strasbourg, 1349, over 1,000 Jews were burned in a single day. In Switzerland and Bavaria, whole communities vanished. This was anti-Semitism born of pestilence. A disease searched for a host, and the people found one. Women who healed with herbs were labeled witches. Roma, travelers, foreigners, expelled from cities. Even foreign doctors were blamed for bringing the plague. Some towns introduced a suspicion index. If you weren't from there, were still alive, and didn't show fear, you knew something. Cities tried what they could: restricted trade, public gatherings, travel, mandatory fumigations, vinegar, fire, the burning of belongings. Venice's Council of Ten became an early version of a public health authority. Florence introduced death registries, a first step in quantifying catastrophe. This was the first attempt in history to turn fear into bureaucracy. People interpreted the plague through whatever lens they had. As punishment for lewdness, towns ordered modesty in clothing. As a sign of the apocalypse, paintings of angels with swords appeared. As war between God and Satan, some organized crusades inside Europe. In many places, plague was officially declared unnatural, giving authorities license to impose extreme measures. People didn't fight the disease, they fought its image. They burned those who looked like threats. They beat themselves, hoping God would show pity. And for the first time, they began to create institutions for disease, even without knowing what a disease truly was. The plague wasn't just tragedy, it was a social earthquake. When 25–50% of a continent dies, feudal rent, tax systems, and urban guilds don't survive. It wasn't just the body that collapsed, it was hierarchy. Peasants, who for years worked for bread and a roof, suddenly became a scarce resource. The land remained, but not enough people to work it. Those who survived began to demand more: land, wages, freedom. In France and England, wages rose even when laws tried to prevent it. Workers began to move between towns seeking better conditions, undermining feudal controls. In 1358, France erupted in the Jacquerie, a peasant uprising against feudal lords. In England, 1381, the Wat Tyler Rebellion demanded an end to serfdom. Germany, Italy, Spain, dozens of local revolts followed. The elites didn't fear the plague, they feared the survivors, because those survivors had stopped being silent. Cities were devastated, artisans died, guilds collapsed. But this opened windows of opportunity for new craftsmen. Women gained space in trade. There simply weren't enough men. In some regions of Europe, women became official workshop owners for the first time, a shift unthinkable before. Priests died in droves and could do nothing to help. People saw God was silent, the Pope was hiding, monks were afraid. Faith remained, but trust in church authority cracked. In Italy and France, heretical movements multiplied, searching for a direct path to God without intermediaries. Food prices soared, supply chains were broken, labor costs rose too. Some elites grew poorer, unable to collect taxes. Trade shrank, but local markets became more important. This gave rise to early forms of contract labor, because the old system of inherited obligation no longer worked. The plague destroyed, but also cleared the field. Feudal power structures weakened. The church lost authority. Money began to matter more than lineage. People became less obedient, more mobile. Some historians argue that the plague paved the way for the Renaissance, tearing down old systems and forcing new thinking. Death didn't just take, it shifted the balance. Post-plague Europe feared differently than before, because fear that doesn't kill you becomes a kind of strength. Death was no longer a unique event. In the 14th century, it became the backdrop of life, like a bell that never stopped ringing. And to keep from losing their minds, people began to process it, draw it, sing it, portray it, turn it into symbol. When death dances in the street, humanity learns to dance with it. The dance of death, dance macabre, emerged at the end of the 14th century. It showed skeletons dancing with popes, kings, peasants, merchants, women, children, no one exempt. The core idea, all are equal before death. The most famous murals appeared in Basel, Lubeck, Dijon, Paris. This wasn't just horror, it was grotesque realism, a way to accept the inevitable. It was during this period that the image of death shifted from angel of death to skeleton with a scythe. The reaper symbolized death harvesting life indiscriminately, bones, because flesh rots, but death remains. In France, people made skeleton figurines. In Germany, skull pendants. Even in monasteries, frescoes depicted death laughing or singing. Texts became infused with mystical repentance, dialogues with the dead, visions of hell, letters from souls. Dramas featured death as the main character, or sinners fearing its approach. Genres emerged like ars moriendi, the art of dying well. One popular theme, the good death, marked by confession, prayer, and peace. Sudden death was worse than death itself. The plague birthed new genres of laments and chants, focused on decay, penitence, salvation. In some monasteries, choirs developed two-voice requiems, so one voice could keep singing if the other died. There were dance psalms, where rhythm mimicked a funeral march. In Burgundy, they found sheet music bearing the phrase "Canta, ut non deficias," sing, so you do not lose heart. Dedicated plague cemeteries were built beyond city walls. Some were adorned with murals of skeletons and corpses. Churches created chambers of reflection, dark rooms with skulls, candles, mirrors, meant for meditating on death. Paris built Les Innocents, a cemetery with ossuaries and walls of bones. Its motto, "We were what you are, you shall be what we are." Art became a way to survive what the mind could not endure. People shaped images of fear to claim power over it. And for the first time, popular culture began to show that death wasn't a villain, but a neighbor. Puppet shows introduced Mr. Death, not always evil, sometimes just part of life. Art became the body of memory when real bodies vanished, and through culture, death stopped being chaos. It became a structured presence. The plague served as a litmus test for 14th century medicine, and it revealed that many cures worked only in prayer. But the catastrophe also marked a turning point, from magic to logic, from humors to something like epidemiology. The dominant theory of the time was humoral theory, a legacy of Hippocrates and Galen. The human body was believed to consist of 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Illness meant an imbalance. Plague, they believed, came from overheated black bile or corrupted phlegm. Other explanations included miasma, poisonous air, hence the herbs and masks; astrology, rare planetary alignments; divine punishment; a moral infection. Methods of treatment were sometimes harmful, though earnest. Bloodletting, via veins, leeches, or cuts. Purgatives and emetics, to cleanse the body. Compresses of urine, pus, or snakeskin. Bathing was discouraged. It was believed water opened the pores to plague. In some places, people were told to sleep on cold stone, avoid laughter, and not look at the sick, because the eye transmits disease. Famous plague doctor masks, with beaks stuffed with herbs, resins, spices. Vinegar was widely used for disinfection, on hands, belongings, even skin. In France, the famed Four Thieves vinegar combined garlic, lavender, rosemary, and vinegar. Legend says 4 thieves robbed the sick without falling ill, because they anointed themselves with the mixture. Who treated the plague? Urban physicians, often educated but helpless. Monks, a form of social medicine, offering care for free. Herbalists, midwives, folk healers, especially in villages. Barber surgeons, who performed minor surgeries, bloodletting, and abscess draining. Often, female healers were more effective, treating symptoms, not theories, but were frequently accused of witchcraft. Some physicians began documenting symptoms, disease stages, and death patterns. In Italy, medical diaries appeared, kept in monasteries. In Paris, contact lists were drawn, noting who had touched or spoken to whom. In Venice, some noted that rats disappeared before outbreaks, but didn't yet connect the dots. Medical ethics also began to emerge. Physicians triaged patients, the hopeless versus treatable. The idea of not treating everyone emerged, not from cruelty, but necessity. Monasteries began isolating the sick in separate spaces, early plague wards. Thus began institutional medicine, born of fear, but no longer reliant solely on prayer. Medieval medicine wasn't stupid, just limited. It sought sense in systems that lacked bacteria. But the plague inspired documentation, procedures, and a growing realization that the body is not divine punishment, but a system. There is no monument to the Black Death in Paris, no mausoleum to plague victims in London. Unlike wars, revolutions, or empires, this catastrophe left no stone. It left a shadow, and that shadow stretches longer than any steeple. The plague had no heroes, no winners, so its memory is blurry yet deep. It lives in traditions, songs, proverbs, and legends. In many cities, plague crosses were erected at mass burial sites. Some regions still hold annual processions to commemorate deliverance from pestilence. After the Black Death, European art became darker, more corporeal, more intimate. Paintings featured dead tones, naked bodies, skeletons, and vanitas motifs. Literature embraced decay, repentance, sorrow. It was the plague that made death a public subject, permissible in art. Cities began establishing hospitals, hospices, new cemeteries. Systems were born for recording deaths, enforcing hygiene, appointing medical officials. These became the foundation for modern public health. In some Italian cities, the first posts for city physician and health inspector appeared after the plague. Governments realized that power wasn't only about taxes, but about protection from disease. They began locking down cities, limiting movement, inventing early forms of ID control. The people in turn began expecting this. If a state exists, it should protect us. For the first time in history, security was redefined, not just from war, but from infection. The plague became an archetype of fear, like the flood or the apocalypse. It remained in fairy tales, sermons, paintings, myths, and at every new epidemic, humanity instinctively recalls the 14th century. Even during COVID-19, the most common metaphor was, it's like the Middle Ages. The plague didn't vanish. It returned for centuries. But 1347, 1353 was its violent apex. No later epidemic had such power to reshape the world. Some historians call it a dark pause between centuries. Others, the very threshold of modernity. The Black Death was not just a tragedy, it was a laboratory of human behavior. It showed that fear doesn't always destroy. Sometimes it transforms. That death doesn't end culture. It pushes it forward. That ruins can become foundations if one survives and rethinks. The plague left no monuments, but we are its monument, because everything we now have, cities, hospitals, science, even our image of death, was forged in the shadow of that pestilence. Thank you for staying with us through this deep and sometimes haunting journey. History is not just about kings and battles. It's about people, fears, and how we keep dancing even when the music stops. If you enjoy thoughtful, slow stories that go beyond the headlines, subscribe to our channel and don't forget to leave a comment. Tell us, what part of this story struck you the most? And also, what historical topic would you like us to explore next? Maybe it's the secrets of ancient libraries? Or what happened to civilizations that simply vanished? We're listening, and we'll be back soon with another shadow, another fire, another question.